When I think about Arthur Ashe, what comes to my mind is how exemplary he was in presenting the best of humankind, not only African Americans, but humankind. He was just grace under pressure. He is a wonderful role model, not only for young people, but for all of us.
Arthur Robert Ashe Jr. was born July 10, 1943, at the segregated St. Philip Hospital in downtown Richmond. He was the first child of Arthur Ashe Sr. and the former Mattie Cordell Cunningham, who had married in 1938.
He lived in a country that was coming to grips with racial equality. Virginia and all of the major cities, the rural areas, operated under Jim Crow. Everything was completely separate. Blacks and whites did not attend schools together. They didn't attend churches. Blacks could not enter restaurants and eat at the same counter with whites. They couldn't go to libraries together. Everything was completely separate. It was like two different worlds.
Separate but equal would lead to one of the most important moments in Ashe's life. In 1947, the Richmond police hired his father as a special officer and caretaker at Brookfield Recreation Center, an 18-acre playground in the predominantly black neighborhood on the city's north side. Baseball fields, tennis courts, and a swimming pool waited just beyond the front door of the tiny five-room house that the family moved into.
I grew up a baseball field away from Arthur. Where the post office is, that used to be Brook Field athletic fields. Arthur's house sit right at the tennis courts and 3 baseball fields. And I live a block outside of the baseball field from him. So it's just walk down and walk to his house.
Tragedy struck the family just a few years after the move to Sled Street. Mattie, pregnant with their 3rd child, died from complications following surgery. It was 1950, and Ashe was only 6 years old. His devastated father faced the task of raising 2 young boys alone.
He was indeed a special man whose motivation was to help his sons have a life that was bigger than his own, and that he would sacrifice anything to do that.
He demanded respect on Brook Field. This is my domain, a no-nonsense type guy, very strict on both his sons.
I remember one of the first things he said to me, he said, you know, I didn't get through high school, but everyone can earn dignity. And that's what I've earned. People that know me believe in me, and that's what I want for Arthur and Johnny. And that was one of the things I think that Arthur always took to heart as well. He once said that the greatest fear he ever had was disappointing his father.
The same year he lost his mother, Ashe met Ronald Charity, his first mentor in the sport that would one day make him famous around the world. Charity was a student and self-taught tennis player at Virginia Union, the historically black college just down the road from Ashe's home. He noticed Ashe hanging around the tennis courts and began giving him his first real lessons about the sport and the importance of education.
Ron Charity was fluid. When you look at Arthur, you could see Ron Charity in his form and everything. So he was a great influence on Arthur, and not too many black kids were playing tennis. Of course, you had to buy a racket, you know, you had to have shoes. You know, back then it was customary that you wear white. You know, all of those economic things that came into play.
He introduced Arthur to a game that he loved, but he was interested in a lot more in introducing him to ideas and concepts and a full life other than just hitting tennis balls. They needed to see somebody who had attained a great education and who was a part of the world, bigger world, and not just somebody who was in the neighborhood.
After working with Ashe for 3 years, Charity recognized that his young pupil was ready for more advanced training. He arranged a meeting with Dr. Robert W. Johnson, a physician and tennis coach in Lynchburg. Dr. Johnson was one of the leaders of the American Tennis Association, an organization devoted to giving African Americans the opportunity and support to learn and play the game. The ATA was an alternative to the United States Lawn Tennis Association, which was for white players only. Dr. J, as he was known to his students, started the ATA's Junior Development Program. He helped train ALTHEA GIBSON, the first black player to win Wimbledon, tennis's most prestigious tournament. Ashe jumped at the chance to spend time learning from one of the most accomplished coaches of his day.
My grandfather is considered to be the force behind black tennis in that he ran a tennis camp at his home in Lynchburg, and every summer he would invite different players to come and hone their skills at his camp. When Ashe first came to Lynchburg, he was probably 10. My father was his primary sparring partner on the court, and I remember an occasion where Ashe would always tell my father that Mr. Charity taught me to do it this way. And my father could not wrap his head around what Mr. Charity said. He wanted Ashe to follow the Johnson way of this is how we're going to do it. They summoned the senior Ashe to Lynchburg, and Mr. Ashe told Arthur, you either do it the way they want you to do it or you'll come back home.
Arthur had somebody that he could look to and say, well, you know, he's already produced probably the best female African-American tennis player, and then he thinks I can be the best male. So Dr. Johnson painted an horizon for him that was pretty broad. You know, don't quit and don't let things get in your way.
You learned a lot of different life lessons in terms of etiquette and how you conduct yourself. So it's interesting the correlation between how playing this sport and having someone who instilled a certain type of discipline and had high expectations. Some became successful tennis players, but generally they became successful professionals in something other than tennis.
Off the courts, Ashe was an avid reader and eager to learn about the world outside of Richmond. He attended Baker School, where he was elected Student Council President in the 6th grade. Then it was on to Benjamin Graves Junior High School, and finally, MAGGIE Walker, one of the city's 2 black high schools.
We had some great teachers. We had some hand-me-down books. We knew where they came from. They had John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson stamped in them, but they were books. It's the content of the book, not the label on the book.
When we look at the 1950s, you still have that sense that education is extremely important. So no matter that the books are hand-me-downs and they're roughshod, get what you can out of it and move on from there.
While Ashe was excelling in the classroom, he was also beginning to find his game on the tennis court. With the help of Dr. Johnson, Ashe was able to travel the region to play against top competition, including white players, for the first time.
The summer of 1959, the Middle Atlantic Junior Tennis Tournament was held in West Virginia. There had never been an African-American player that I'd seen playing in the junior tournaments, the ones that I had played in. And so when I got to that tournament, I didn't expect to see anyone of color. And I looked on the draw sheet when I first arrived, and I looked in the 18 and under division, and ranked number 1 was Arthur Ashe Jr. from Richmond, Virginia. It was a moment of a lot of different emotions. One which was obvious was just embarrassment. I felt guilty that he was a great player, a good player, seeded number 1 in the tournament, and from my hometown, and I'd never met him, and I could tell immediately what segregation really meant in my life, which up until that time was kind of a system that I didn't think too much about. I lived in the west end of Richmond, and he immediately told me that he knew where I lived. I asked him why, and he said because his father is cutting grass for a neighbor of ours up the street, and that he'd read about me in the Times-Dispatch. And as I found out during the day, he had played in a lot of tournaments outside of the South and done very well. So he was an accomplished player, but people in Richmond could never read about him.
Things weren't done a certain way back in the 50s and even into the 60s a little bit, as far as even coverage in the newspaper. So it was probably a lot of people who were from Richmond who might not have known much about him either.
During the school year, he was limited to play at Brookfield, but MAGGIE Walker created its first tennis team with Ashe as its centerpiece. When lights were added to the courts outside his front door, he was able to practice any time of day.
Arthur's father being the superintendent, he has the key to the box. Arthur just get the box, and we, turn the lights on. We'd play at 11 o'clock at night, and that was it. However long we wanted to play, hit the ball, that's what he would do, because that's what he did. That's what he enjoyed doing.
Other courts around Richmond were not as welcoming to Ashe. Bird Park, where the city's best white players regularly competed against one another, would not allow Ashe to play because of the color of his skin. The Blues Armory, which housed the National Guard, refused access to their indoor courts.
We were kind of excited because we thought, here's an opportunity that we could get Arthur in because it's an armory, it's a National Guard armory, so that's got to be integrated. But it turned out that they wouldn't allow him in. And at that point in time, Arthur's father decided that if he was going to progress in his tennis, he had to play full year round.
Ashe's family decided he should spend his senior year at Sumner High School in St. Louis. Richard HUDLIN was a teacher and tennis coach at the school and also a good friend with Dr. Johnson. Ashe graduated with the highest grade point average in the school and began making a name for himself nationally because of his tennis skills. In November 1960, he won the National Junior Indoor Championship. It was his first USLTA national title, the organization that had previously denied him access to play in its tournaments. By the time he graduated high school, Ashe was the 5th-ranked junior tennis player in the country and had earned a scholarship to play tennis for coach J.D. Morgan and the UCLA Bruins.
I could tell after his first semester of his freshman year, he was better, but then after his sophomore year, the first semester of his sophomore year, he'd taken another quantum jump, and he was just so aggressive, just controlling points both when he served and when he didn't.
Ashe's tennis career blossomed at UCLA. In 1963, he became the first African-American ever selected to play for the United States Davis Cup team.
Are you afraid this will put too much pressure on you?
It could pressure me, but I'm not going to let it pressure me, actually. I've seen what pressure can do to people when they're under the pressure in playing, and I'm going to try really hard not to let it happen to me.
In 1965, he won the NCAA singles title, doubles title, and was captain of the Bruins team that won the championship. After graduating from UCLA, Ashe joined the Army, where in his final year of service, he won his first major tennis championship, the 1968 U.S. Open.
Wow, it was almost like a dream. Winning his own national title in 1968, when he was still very young, was kind of a surprise in one way that he'd gotten so good so fast from the few years before where we were just kind of hitting it around.
After completing his service in the Army, Ashe turned pro and began a successful career. Opponents were often surprised by the strength and quickness that defied his slight build.
He wasn't a very big person. He was a very thin person, a little over 6 feet, but he learned how to hit the serve really hard. And of course, tennis, if you can serve hard, you can get some free points out of it, and especially on hard surfaces or grass. And he could get around the court pretty quickly too. He could cover a lot of court and win points by scrambling around a lot.
He used to tell me, as you get in shape, the court gets smaller. But if you're not in shape, I'm gonna run you, right? Sideline to sideline. I'm gonna bring you up and I'm gonna lob it over your head.
Beauty.
He was aggressive. He make you run, 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 run.
The summer of 1975 was the pinnacle of Ashe's tennis career. After entering the tournament as the 6th seed, Ashe defeated the heavily favored Jimmy Connors to win the Wimbledon championship.
It was on the front page of the paper, not just the sports section, and our sports editor at the time, Bill Millsaps, called over to the All England Club in England and actually talked with Arthur and got some insight from him about the match, so we could sort of have our own story.
Back home in Richmond, Ashe's father was relishing in his son's accomplishments.
I remember hearing about Arthur winning and running into Mr. Ashe that same day, and it was just so joyful. I don't know that I've ever been happier for anyone.
In those days, Wimbledon wasn't shown live. You had to wait till like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I remember him telling me that even when he was watching it, that he almost had a heart attack watching him play.
You just don't imagine that somebody that's just your buddy is going to wind up doing these great things. You know, those records are there, his championship was there, and it never can be erased. And I'll always, to my dying day, when I look at the US Open program and when I look at the Wimbledon program, I look for 68 and 75.
Ashe was now known worldwide, but Richmond was still central to his life. Ashe used his notoriety to help the people of Richmond, especially children. He was able to put aside the prejudicial treatment he experienced as a youngster in order to help the next generation of kids growing up in the area.
He never acted in the way towards others that some acted towards him. He said, don't ever slam a shut door that's become open. I think most people in the area were ignorant. They said, well, of course. It's something like they want to rewrite the situation and, oh, Arthur Ashe grew up playing tennis in Richmond, so he's one of us. In fact, I had many people say, oh, well, did you play with him at Bird Park? You know, and no, he couldn't play at Bird Park. I mean, this guy's #1 in the country. He was unranked in Richmond.
He believed very strongly that it was important for each of us to do what we could to make the world better. Tennis was the vehicle for him, but he expanded it so much more and really became a world-class leader.
He held tennis clinics, made public appearances, and even started a mentoring program in the schools.
Virginia Heroes was founded by Arthur Ashe. It's really an interactive program where they address current topics like bullying, drugs. It also talked about Ashe's life and how he grew up. Children today, especially children of color, need to see people who have been successful in order to give them hope to be successful contributors.
Ashe's legacy as a champion of education is further cemented in the Henrico County Public School that bears his name, Arthur Ashe Jr. Elementary.
That's great. That's great. That says something, you know. And hopefully, the kids that are attending that school will understand about the individual and what he was all about. Just as we graduated from Maggie Walker High School, and we look at what Maggie Walker did and set an example for us to follow.
In 1979, Ashe had a heart attack and underwent quadruple bypass surgery later the same year. Continued chest pains forced him to retire from tennis a year later. 3 years later, Ashe needed a second heart bypass surgery, and this time he was slow to recover. Doctors recommended he have a blood transfusion to help speed up the healing process. In 1988, Ashe was diagnosed with HIV, a result of the transfusion 5 years earlier. He kept his condition secret until April 1992, when he was forced to tell the world.
I now will see people who react to me differently in the street. I'm really not sure how I'm going to deal with it. I know I will.
Just 10 months later, on February 6, 1993, Ashe died from AIDS-related pneumonia. He was 49 years old. Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder allowed Ashe's body to lie in state at the governor's mansion for a public viewing. This gubernatorial honor had not been bestowed since 1863 for Confederate General Stonewall Jackson.
I think the sight of so many just ordinary people, not his fellow players and not people that had known him firsthand, but the amount of respect that people had to brave the elements and to stand in line for hours really made me feel like Arthur would have been shocked and surprised at all the outpouring of respect and grief.
More than 6,000 people attended the funeral service at the Arthur Ashe Jr. Athletic Center. Celebrities, athletes, and local residents flocked to pay their final respects.
He was gracious, righteous, honest, dignified, intelligent, and committed. He was a credit to his race, the human race.
It was a tremendous outpouring of just talking about his life and what he meant to them and just the kind of person he was. I guess a lot of people there were not from Richmond either. They were just people that he had encountered along the way in his personal life and his life on the tour. Then you had the people who grew up knowing him, and probably some who didn't really realize for a long time who Arthur Ashe was, even though he grew up here, just because he wasn't allowed to participate in tennis.
At Ashe's request, he was buried in Woodland Cemetery next to his mother, Mattie.
Some people make art to live, and some people live to make art. The Ashe sculpture was living to make art. It became an obsession in the sense that I met the man and I believed that he absolutely deserved acknowledgement in his hometown.
Local sculptor Paul DePasquale met Ashe in the spring of 1992 during a tennis clinic in Richmond. DePasquale wrote Ashe a letter in December of that same year with his thoughts on the project.
So I sent him pictures of my work, and he called me up a month after getting my letter, writing him. And that's really how it started.
The two had agreed to meet in New York a few weeks later, but Ashe's condition worsened, and he passed away before the meeting took place.
I went to his funeral the following Wednesday at the Arthur Ashe Center, and I thought, well, what do I do? This is something he and I set up. As far as I knew, nobody else knew about it. However, when I came back from that funeral on that Wednesday, there was a package in the mail addressed to me from Arthur Ashe in his handwriting. Return address, New York City. And I opened it up, and it was photographs with a Post-it note that simply read, "Dear Paul, I just wanted you to have these. Let's talk soon. A. Ashe." So at that moment, I felt I was obligated to at least follow through.
DePasquale worked with Ashe's widow and other family members to plan the concept of the statue. The location of the statue, however, would prove to be the bigger issue. Monument Avenue in Richmond's Fan District had traditionally honored Confederate leaders. The idea of placing a new statue among them, a statue of an African American, sparked a great debate.
When you look at Monument Avenue, the phrase that comes to my mind is the power of place. And Monument Avenue is one of those places in Virginia history that has held a lot of power, particularly for the Confederate contingency. They have felt very strongly that that is their avenue. And to have Arthur Ashe on that avenue defies everything that they believe in.
There were a lot of people who were fighting the monument itself or where it was going to be. What I felt at the time and what I still feel is the case was what won. The elegance, the dignity, the significance of Arthur Ashe Jr. Was undeniable. And even though people might want to pick on the fact that he was an athlete, shouldn't be there, or he was too young, he wasn't a Civil War person, or he was an African American, whatever their argument might be, they could never argue with the record of his life.
Ashe's statue was unveiled on Monument Avenue, July 10th, 1996. It would have been his 53rd birthday.
Because I wanted to honor him in his hometown, I wanted it to be the message he wanted to give. Hearing him speak and his passion about education, that was my goal, was to have a rapport between the Ashe figure and the children. The tennis racket, he was right-handed, and so the tennis racket is casually in his left hand, which is lowered from the books, and the books in his right hand in a victory pose was his request, in as much as he said he wanted to show that books were the most important part of education, that knowledge is power.
To see him holding a book up in a tennis racket, that was Arthur, a role model for anybody and everybody.
I think he had a lesson to share, and the lesson was about racism and was about prejudging people and their capacities and what they can do. And it's not an easy one. I think how he conducted his life and his friendships and his reputation, like many great people who rise to the top in their field, it's the other things that they say and do that rounds out their greatness. I think that's the case for Arthur Ashe.
He himself believed in equality. He believed in pursuing perfection, and he lived that. He exemplified that in every way.
His life made a difference, and you can do it too. So that's what I really hope that people will remember, is what Mr. Ashe said about his son. No matter where you're born and no matter what your circumstance, you can always earn the dignity of your fellow man, and that is really what he did.